the second session of today's event on the first big question, creation, or how did the world come into being. The third speaker of today is our very own Michael Chase. And I say our very own because if I've counted correctly, Mike, you hold currently 4 positions. The OP position still holds. So let me share with everyone what these are. Michael Chase currently holds 4 positions. He's senior researcher at the Centre Jean Pépin at the CNRS in Paris, visiting professor at the Universidad Panamericana in Mexico City, adjunct professor at the University of Victoria, Canada, and visiting scholar at our institute, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. And of course, Michael is also a co-organizer of the series Scientific Questions Then and Now. Michael works at the intersection of Greek, Arabic, and Latin philosophy and has published very widely on ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, Greek and Latin patristics, and medieval Latin and Arabic philosophy. How can all this be in one person? Well, maybe part of the answer is that he was a former student of Pierre Hadot. And one reason that also explains why he has translated half a dozen of Hadot's books into English and has made them available to an English-speaking audience. Today, Michael is giving a talk on creation and continuity in Neoplatonism and piggybacks, I suppose, very much on Alberto Ross's talk. It's a tremendous pleasure for me, and also I should say for Alex, to hand the word to you, Michael, and say the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that splendid introduction, Katja. I can't possibly live up to it. You've set the bar way too high, but thank you anyway. Yes, I'm very grateful to Alberto for his luminous and clear presentation of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle that will allow me to take them for granted, take the views of Plato and Aristotle for granted to a certain extent in what I'm going to say. Let me just get back to the beginning here. I'm going to be looking into a more specific aspect of the kinds of issues that Alberto was talking about. And I'm going to, since this is a program originating in a German institution, I'm going to allow myself to start with a quote from Goethe. Wie alles sich zum ganzen Welt webt, eins in dem andern winkt, wirkt und lebt, wie Himmelskräfte auf und niedersteigen und sich die goldenen Eimer reichen, mit segenduftenden Schwingen vom Himmel durch die Erde dringen, harmonisch, all das All durchklingen. And I assure you that the English translation is not as good as the German is. So what I'm going to be talking about here is basically the contrast between 2 points of view, between pagan and Christian Neoplatonists on the origin of reality. And of course, they're going to be interpreting Plato and Aristotle. So pagan Neoplatonists basically believed that a first principle, whether known as the good or the one or the demiurge, brings reality into existence, or in other words, creates reality, by means of a series of intermediaries through a process of atemporal, continuous emanation of ontologically lower principles from higher ones. Now, some Christian Neoplatonists, like John Philoponus, a contemporary of Simplicius, hold, on the contrary, that God creates reality directly and instantaneously, atroos in Greek. That is to say, outside of time or simultaneously with the creation of time. Now, it's not immediately obvious what the difference between these viewpoints amounts to. For both parties, what they have in common is that reality comes into being, is created outside of time. For the pagans, this is the case because creation is atemporal because time doesn't apply to suprasensible realities, and hence not to the process by which the first principle emanates forth reality through the successive hypotheses of intellect, the soul, nature, and finally sensible matter, sensible reality, and our universe, matter. In contrast, Christians like Philoponus want to argue that creation is atemporal because it takes place in the now, or the instant, en toinun in Greek. And this now or instant is not a part of time because it is the limit of time. So my proposal, as far as the distinction concerned, is going to be this. What distinguishes the two views is that for the pagans, creation is continuous, while for the Christian Philoponus and his followers, it is discontinuous. And in turn, the best criterion for this distinction, I want to say, is that if the world can be said to have a first moment of its existence, then we have to do with discontinuous or instantaneous creation. If, on the other hand, it makes no sense to speak of a first moment of creation, then we have to do with continuous creation or emanation. Okay, a bit of background. I'm going to go into a bit of detail, more detail on points that Alberto raised. According to Aristotle, whenever you take 2 points on a line, A and B, or 2 instants in time, then no matter how close together they are, it is always possible to take an additional potential infinity of points between A and B. So this is Aristotelian continuity in a nutshell. In this respect, Aristotelian continuity entails or is identical with infinite divisibility. So Aristotle is basing his idea on 3 hierarchically nested concepts. First of all, there are things that are successive, FXAs, A and B are successive. If B follows A and there is nothing of the same genus between A and B. One slightly more complex condition is that of contiguity, echomenon in Greek. And here, A and B are contiguous if they're successive and they're also in contact such that their limits are together. And finally, we have the third level, which presupposes the preceding 2, but adds something new. Things are continuous, syneches in Greek, if A and B are successive, contiguous, and also the limits by which they touch each other are 1. Now, Aristotle's conception of continuity is physical rather than mathematical, although it's interesting to follow the history of this idea of mathematical continuity with modern intuitionist mathematicians taking up Aristotle's idea of a merely potential infinity as opposed to an actual infinity, the point of view of Cantor. But generally, for Aristotle, continuity pertains to things like time, space, and motion, which have an uninterrupted unity. In what sense? Well, in the sense that any boundary between them is merely potential and not actual. What about the Neoplatonists? Well, the Neoplatonists, except the possible exception of Damascius, believe that these Aristotelian notions of continuity do a pretty good job of explaining the sensible material world in which we live. However, when it comes to realities in the intelligible world, which is more real, of course, according to the Platonists, continuity is going to have to take on another form because time, space, and motion do not exist there in the same form as they do in this world. Now, strict Aristotelian continuity, according to the Neoplatonists, only comes into play when the concentrated, non-spatial, atemporal, intelligible realities unfold or develop, acquiring extension or dimensionality. In other words, they come into play when the one becomes the many. In the intelligible world, by contrast, the law of continuity refers to 2 basic aspects. First, in what I want to call the quasi or proto-spatial aspect, it refers to the gapless nature of the divine procession of reality as it emanates from the first principle. And in its, what I want to call its proto-temporal aspect, it refers to the fact that there can be no atemporal moment, if we can wrap our heads around that idea, at which the process of emanation is not taking place. So these distinctions come from the great Neoplatonic scholar, E.R. Dodds, who postulated that there are 3 basic laws of Neoplatonism: law of emanation, law of undiminished giving, and law of continuity. And he describes the law of continuity as stating that as there is no void in the physical universe, so there is none in the spiritual or the intelligible universe. Spiritual continuity means that the qualitative interval between any term of the procession and its immediate consequent is the minimum difference compatible with distinctness. There are thus no gaps in the divine devolution. And as an example, I'm citing a quote text from Proclus. The procession of real beings, he writes, far more even than the positions of physical bodies in space, leave no void, but everywhere there are mean terms between the extremities, which provide for them a mutual linkage. And here we get some idea of where Goethe might have got his ideas of the harmonious interlinking of all things. And this becomes more clear if we look at testimonies, Neoplatonic testimonies on the golden chain, which is an image that comes from Homer, of a great golden chain that comes down from the heavens and links together all things. I just want to briefly cite two testimonies, one from a 5th century Latin Neoplatonist and the other from a 6th century Greek Neoplatonist. Macrobius says, given that all beings succeed one another in continuous sequence, continuis successionibus se sequantur, progressively degenerating as they approach the bottom, we discover, looking at things more closely, from the supreme God to the ultimate dregs, one single uninterrupted connection of reciprocal bonds. This is Homer's golden chain, which, as the poet recounts, the god hung down from heaven to earth. And a century later, in writing in a different part of the world and in a different language, Olympiodorus says that there are thus other greater powers, which the poets call the golden chain because of their continuity. And this same tradition goes on in medieval Islamic and Jewish thought. The great Jewish physician and scholar Maimonides writes, for instance, in his guide for the perplexed, after he's just shown by citing Galen that the wisdom of the creator is shown by the use of gradual transitions in anatomy and zoology, he explains that an immediate transition from one contrary to another is impossible. So we can't have any more in the physical world as it is now than in its creation. We can't have this sudden transition from one thing to another. All transitions must be gradual. Now, what is the interplay between continuity and the possibility of instantaneous motion? Well, the inventor of Neoplatonist, Plotinus, entertains the idea of instantaneous motion, basing himself on Aristotle's occasional admission of instantaneous change. And we'll come back to that later. He argues, Plotinus, that there could be a timeless all-at-once motion, which could, he says, have begun in a timeless instant. So we could have time in that sense might be an emergent concept. Time could come forth from something that is not non-temporal. But Simplicius, whom we've already met, replies that to say motion is timeless contradicts the fact that it traverses distance and develops, while the hypothesis that something begins in a timeless instant destroys the continuity of its nature. So, as we saw, in the case of proto-temporal continuity, this implies that there can be no time in which the generation of the world did not take place. And this, in turn, is just another way of saying or affirming the doctrine of continuous creation. And this doctrine is expressed, for instance, in Proclus, commenting on the passage that Alberto mentioned, the passage where Plato writes that the demiurge, his reason for creating the world was that he is good, and that which is good naturally tends to want to share its goodness by making other things good as well. Proclus writes, from all this, it is easy to conclude that the demiurge produces poiei eternally, and that the cosmos is everlasting, with the kind of everlastingness that this extends to all time, and that the latter is always becoming ordered. If the demiurge is always good, he always wants what is good for all things. And if he is always capable of doing good, then he is always actually energizing what is good, and actualizing, what is good. But if he is always actualizing what is good, then he is always producing what is good. And if he is always producing, the cosmos is always coming to be. So we see how we have a series of interlocking ideas which closely entail one another. And if you question any one of these premises, of course, the whole edifice comes tumbling down. But if we accept them all, then the unavoidable result is the doctrine of continuous creation. Okay, let's go briefly back to Aristotle here. Famously, Aristotle writes that time is the number of motion. Therefore, if time is eternal, motion must be eternal as well. But time is eternal, Aristotle wants to say. He proves this by saying that time cannot be conceived without the instant, anu tu nun. Now, this instant or this now is not time, but it's the limit of time at which two extents or intervals of time meet. But since the end of one stretch of time, the past, and the beginning of the next stretch of time, the future, are the same, it's the now that makes time a continuum. Because as we've seen, a continuum just is a series of things that succeed one another and which have in common a limit by which they touch one another. So that's a proof per impossibilem here. Let's assume that time is finite so that it comes to an end at some point. But since the now or the instant, henceforth t, is always intermediary between two stretches of time, whatever t one picks out as the last t is also necessarily the beginning of a new t. And likewise, there can't be a beginning of time because whichever t one picks out as the first t necessarily implies the existence of a t minus one prior to that t, and so on ad infinitum. So the continuity of time, the fact that no matter which t one points out, there is always a t minus one and a t plus one on either side of it, implies that time is infinitely divisible, has infinite duration, and it also implies that there can therefore be no such thing as a first or a last moment in the existence of the universe. Now, that's all very well and good until around 529 BC, at the moment when in the East, at Athens, the Neoplatonic schools were being closed down by the Emperor Justinian. John Philoponus comes around and he starts to write, all of a sudden, he starts to write treatises against Aristotle and against Proclus. And he's proposing a Christian point of view. And in order to do that, he's going to have to argue that the universe comes into being at a specific point in time and is finite. And to do that, he's going to have to defeat Aristotle's arguments for eternity. Now, he does this in a number of interesting ways. One very interesting way that's been amply studied by Richard Sorabji is that he uses Aristotle's own arguments about the impossibility of an actual infinity. He says time can't be infinite because no infinite series can be traversed in a finite time. No one infinite series can be greater than another, and etc. But I won't go into that here. It's a fascinating topic, but it's been well discussed elsewhere. What I want to concentrate here is both Philoponus and Simplinkis's comments on Aristotle's proof of time's eternity by its continuity. So Philoponus, when he confronts Aristotle's arguments that we've just seen, he says, well, Aristotle, you're just begging the question. When you declare that there's another t before and after each t one picks out, all you're doing is stipulating that time is infinite. Just as to say that there is a point at both ends of each segment of a line amounts to stipulating that the line is infinite. Simplicius responds, no. Aristotle is not begging the question. All he's doing is assuming what is, or working out what follows necessarily from the intermediate nature of the nun, the instant or the now, which doesn't need to be argued for because it's self-evident. Then Philoponus unveils a different angle of attack. He wants to say that not everything that comes into being does so through motion. Now, he's pointing here to the fact that whereas Aristotle usually defends the idea of a spatial and a temporal continuum, he sometimes allows for instantaneous changes in motion. In different places of his work, he argues that there can be a coming into being that takes place all at once, athroagenesis in Greek, without motion or temporal extension. And there can also be a perishing of the same kind. And the examples he uses are the appearance and disappearance of perfect forms in their substrates, points, mathematical points that come to be united, contact in general, lightning, visible perception. All these things, according to Philoponus, take place instantaneously. And Philoponus wants to use these as examples to argue that the demiurge, the creator, directly produces the world in precisely this way, instantaneously and without temporal extension. And Philoponus goes on to say that what God's creative act is the realization or the actualization of a hexis, a habitus, a state. And it's similar to the way in which our senses are activated by sensible objects. Now, Aristotle himself teaches that such an actualization is instantaneous. It's not a change, a metabole, and it is not even a motion properly so called. So, Philoponus says, well, the world's instantaneous transition from not being to being, brought about by God, is thus equivalent to what we now would call a phase transition, the freezing of water or the curdling of milk, which will continue to be instantaneous. And I think it's worth noting in passing that the idea of phase transitions, if I understand contemporary cosmology, is very important in ideas like Guth's theory of inflation. Anyway, by arguing in this way, Philoponus can attribute to the demiurge a creative act that, because it is instantaneous, breaks with the orthodox Aristotelian understanding of the primacy of continuity. So what does Simplicius think of this? Well, he's not impressed. Simplicius argues that whereas Aristotle does sometimes allow for instantaneous change or generation, when he does so, he doesn't mean that these processes are exempt from change in time. Simplicius says that these processes are always extended, and in them, one thing always falls upon another, but it's just that in these cases, extension, change, and time are so concentrated or contracted as to be imperceptible. Here we might almost think of an analogy with what Jean-Luc was talking about. Well, maybe these things are just different at a level that is too small for us to perceive. Simplicius reaffirms that action as a process takes place in time, and that phenomena like lightning contact and phase transitions like the curdling of milk or the freezing of water can be said to take place all at once, only in the sense that they take place as a whole and not bit by bit. But in general, things cannot have come into being, gegonenai in Greek, without going through the process of coming into being. So Philoponus's model, I argue, is a break from orthodox Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thought about continuity. From a proto-spatial perspective, there is no longer, as in pagan Neoplatonism, a gradual devolution of the spiritual essence, leading eventually to materiality, but there is an all-at-once creation by God of something wholly other than he, with no intermediaries. And from proto-temporal perspective, creation is not a perpetual affair, as in pagan Neoplatonist, but it is a one-time affair. Pace Aristotle, says Philoponus, the world did have a first moment of its existence, prior to which it did not exist, and it's going to have a last moment, after which the world will no longer exist. Now, we might point to Proclus again, who I think he sets the dichotomy very clearly. Proclus says what comes into being is said in two senses, either as what always is, ie, or always comes into being, sorry, or what does so at a specific moment, pote in Greek. Now this sums up, I think, in a nutshell, what's at issue in the debate between creationists and emanationists. For pagan emanationists, the sensible world always has been, is, and always will be in the process of coming into being. Philoponus, in contrast, opts for the pote option. The world came into existence and will pass out of existence at a given moment in time, pote. We can say when it happened. So what conclusions can we draw from all this? I think we can say that the most important among the factors that distinguish Philoponus's creationism from Simplicius's emanationism is that for the former it makes sense, and indeed it is unavoidable, to speak of a first instant in the history of the universe prior to which the universe did not exist. Now, for an emanationist like the pagan Simplicius, this makes no sense, because Simplicius, like Aristotle, believes that time and motion are continuous in the physical world. And just as a side note, one could have an entirely other presentation on the topic of the posterity of this thought in the Islamic world, where Al-Kindi and his school are going to side with Philoponus, Al-Farabi and his successors among the Falasifa, or the Aristotelianizing philosophers, are going to side just as resolutely with Simplicius. So, starting out from the notion of continuity, I hope we've made some progress toward identifying the difference between creationism and emanationism in general. On the assumption that some kind of a first principle, whether the Abrahamic God or the Neoplatonic one, provides the world with existence, then if on the creationist hypothesis of John Philoponus and his followers, the world can be said to have a first moment of its existence, in other words, if time is discontinuous, then we have to do with creation. If, as in the case of the doctrine of continuous creation, as espoused by pagan Neoplatonists, it makes no sense to speak of a first moment of creation, in other words, if time is continuous, then we have to do with emanation. Thank you very much for your attention.